Welcome back, folks. Bob here again. Last time, we talked about the spark that ignited the American Revolution, the taxes, the tea, the anger building in 13 colonies that had finally had enough. Today we talk about the moment everything changed, the moment when angry words turned into bullets, the moment a cold April morning in Massachusetts changed the world forever. This is the story of the shot heard round the world, and I promise you, it's not the simple story you learned in school. Picture this. It's April 18th, 1775, middle of the night. Boston is under military occupation. British General Thomas Gage has had enough of these rebellious colonists stockpiling weapons. He knows the Massachusetts militia has ammunition stored in Concord, about 20 miles outside Boston. So he makes a decision. Send 700 troops, his best soldiers, to march to Concord under cover of darkness. Seize the weapons, arrest the rebel leaders Sam Adams and John Hancock if they can find them. Show these colonists who's in charge. It should have been simple. It should have been quick. It should have been over before anyone even knew what happened. But the British made one crucial mistake. They underestimated the colonists' intelligence network. You see, Boston was full of spies, stable boys, servants, shop owners, regular people who watched the British troops, noticed patterns, and passed information to the Patriots. And on that night in April, they saw something unusual. British soldiers moving quietly through the streets, boats being prepared at the harbor. Something big was happening. The alarm went out. Now, everyone knows about Paul Revere's midnight ride. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote that famous poem about it. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It's romantic. It's dramatic. It's also not quite accurate. First of all, Revere didn't ride alone. There was William Dawes riding a different route, and Dr. Samuel Prescott, who joined them along the way. Second, Revere never shouted, "The British are coming!" Think about it. These colonists were British. They considered themselves British subjects fighting for their rights. What Revere actually shouted as he pounded on doors through the countryside was, "The regulars are coming out!" The regulars. That's what they called the British Army. But here's what matters. By dawn on April 19th, the alarm had spread across the countryside like wildfire. Church bells rang, signal guns fired, drums beat in village squares. The militia system, the one the colonists had built where every man was supposed to grab his musket and respond to danger, it kicked into gear. The British troops marching through the darkness had no idea what was waiting for them. They reached Lexington around 5 in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise, cold, misty. And there, on the town green, in the center of this small village, stood about 70 colonial militiamen. 70 farmers and shopkeepers and craftsmen, some of them teenagers, some of them old men, facing 700 professional British soldiers. The militia captain was John Parker. He was sick, probably dying of tuberculosis, but he stood there with his men anyway, and he told them something that would echo through history. Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Let it begin here. Think about those words. Parker knew they were outnumbered 10-1. He knew most of his men had never been in battle. He knew they might die, but he also knew that sometimes you have to stand for something bigger than yourself. The British commander, Major John Pitcairn, rode forward. He was actually a decent man, as British officers go. He didn't want bloodshed. He shouted at the militia to disperse, to lay down their weapons. Parker, seeing how badly outnumbered they were, told his men to disperse. They started to leave. They weren't putting down their weapons, but they were leaving. And then, someone fired a shot. To this day, nobody knows who. The British swore it was the colonists. The militiamen swore it was the British. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe someone panicked. Maybe it was deliberate. But in that moment, everything changed. The British soldiers, trained professionals, fired a volley. The militiamen scattered. The brief fight lasted maybe 15 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead. 10 more were wounded. The British had 2 soldiers slightly injured. It wasn't much of a battle. The British had won easily. They reformed their ranks and marched on toward Concord, probably thinking the worst was over. They had no idea what was coming. The British reached Concord around 8 in the morning. They searched for weapons. Most had already been moved, but they found some supplies and started destroying them. They weren't looting or burning the town. They were actually quite disciplined about it, just doing their job. But while they searched, something was happening in the hills around Concord, something the British didn't expect. The militia was gathering, not just from Concord, but from everywhere, from Acton, from Lincoln, from Bedford, from towns 10, 15, 20 miles away. They'd heard the alarm bells, they'd heard the guns, and they came. By mid-morning, there were hundreds of militiamen in the hills around Concord, and they were angry. Word had reached them about what happened at Lexington, about the dead men on the green. At the North Bridge outside Concord, a group of about 400 militia faced about 90 British soldiers guarding the bridge. The militia advanced. The British fired warning shots. Then they fired into the crowd. 2 militiamen fell dead, and the militia fired back. This time it wasn't a scattered skirmish. This was a real fight. The militia, using tactics they'd learned fighting in the frontier wars, fired from cover, aimed carefully, and shot British officers first. 3 British soldiers died. 9 more were wounded. The British troops at the bridge panicked and retreated back into Concord. For the first time, the British Army had been forced to retreat by colonial militia. Now the British commander realized he had a problem. He was deep in hostile territory. The countryside was swarming with armed men. He needed to get his troops back to Boston. Fast. Around noon, the British started the long march back, 16 miles to safety. It should have taken about 5 hours. It turned into a nightmare. The militia didn't fight like European armies. They didn't stand in lines and fire volleys. They hid behind trees, stone walls, buildings. They fired and disappeared. They knew this countryside. Every hill, every turn in the road, every place to hide. The British marched in formation, exposed, perfect targets. Colonial musket balls ripped through their ranks. Officers fell from their horses. Soldiers collapsed in the road. The professional army started to panic, breaking formation, running. The British later called it a moving ambush. Mile after mile, the attacks never stopped. When they climbed a hill, militiamen fired from the top. When they crossed a field, bullets came from the tree line. When they passed through a town, shots came from windows and doorways. A British officer wrote later, "We retired for 15 miles under an incessant fire, which like a moving circle surrounded and followed us wherever we went." Only the arrival of British reinforcements from Boston saved them from complete disaster. Even then, the fighting continued until they reached the safety of Charlestown, across the river from Boston. The final count? The British had suffered about 300 casualties, nearly 300 dead, wounded, or missing. The Americans had lost about 90 men. But the numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is what those 16 miles proved. It proved that colonial militia could fight British regulars and win. It proved that the tactics of frontier warfare could defeat traditional European military might. It proved that these farmers and shopkeepers had the courage to stand against the most powerful army in the world. News of Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire through the colonies. Within days, Thousands of militia from all over New England were marching toward Boston, surrounding the city, trapping the British Army inside. The revolution had begun. Not with a declaration, not with a vote, but with blood on a village green and bodies along a country road. And that first shot on Lexington Green, the one nobody can identify, the one that started it all, history remembers it as the shot heard round the world, because in a very real sense, it was. It announced that something new was being born, that ordinary people could stand up to kings and empires, that the old order could be challenged. But here's what we need to remember. Even after Lexington and Concord, most colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They were fighting for their rights as Englishmen, not for independence. They wanted the king to recognize their grievances, to restore their liberties. Independence? That radical idea was still months away. In May, the Second Continental Congress met again in Philadelphia. They faced a crisis. There was fighting in Massachusetts, but no official army, no unified command, no plan. They were at war, but they hadn't declared war. Congress made a crucial decision. They created the Continental Army, and they needed a commander. Someone with military experience, someone the colonies would trust, someone who could unite 13 different colonies into one fighting force. They chose George Washington, the tall Virginia planter who'd fought in the French and Indian War, the man who showed up to Congress in his old military uniform, as if volunteering for the job, the man who would refuse to take a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. Washington accepted the command and rode north to Boston to take charge of the army besieging the city. But before he could get there, something happened that would prove just how brutal this war was going to be. In June, the British decided to break out of Boston. They planned to take the high ground on the Charlestown Peninsula, the hills overlooking the city. If they controlled those heights, they could dominate the harbor and the surrounding area. The colonists heard about the plan. On the night of June 16th, about 1,200 colonial soldiers marched onto the peninsula and started building fortifications. They were supposed to fortify Bunker Hill, the highest point. Instead, probably by mistake, they fortified Breed's Hill, closer to Boston, but not as strategically strong. All night they dug. By dawn, they'd built walls of earth and logs, a fort on top of the hill. When the British woke up and saw those fortifications, they were shocked. How had the rebels built a fort overnight? Right under their noses? British General William Howe decided to take the hill with a frontal assault. He could have surrounded it. He could have used his ships to bombard it from the harbor. But he wanted to teach these rebels a lesson, to show them what happened when you challenged British soldiers. Around 3 in the afternoon, about 2,000 British troops formed up and began marching up Breed's Hill. They were magnificent. Redcoats bright in the sun, bayonets fixed, drums beating, perfect ranks, perfect discipline. They looked unstoppable. The colonial commander, William Prescott, watched them come. His men were nervous. Some had never been in battle. They were low on ammunition, and they were about to face the most feared infantry in the world. Prescott gave an order that would become legend. Whether he actually said these exact words or not, the message was clear. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Hold your fire. Wait. Let them get close. Make every shot count. The British came up the hill. Closer. Closer. The colonists held their fire. You can imagine how hard that must have been. Watching that red wall coming at you, knowing they had bayonets, knowing they were professional killers. At almost point-blank range, the colonists opened fire. The British line shattered. Officers fell. Entire companies were cut down. The survivors retreated back down the hill. The British reformed and came again. Same result. Devastating fire at close range. More casualties. Another retreat. General Howe looked around and saw his staff officers, the men who'd been standing near him, almost all dead or wounded. The field was covered with British casualties, but Howe ordered a third assault. This time, the British changed tactics. They dropped their heavy packs. They aimed for the colonial position, not the entire hill, and they came fast. The colonists fired again. But this time, many of them were running out of ammunition. Their shots were less effective. Some were loading rocks into their muskets, anything to keep firing. The British reached the walls. Now it was hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets against rifle butts. The colonists, outnumbered and out of ammunition, had to retreat. The British had won the hill, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British casualties. Nearly half the attacking force. For comparison, the colonists lost about 400 men. A British officer said afterward, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." It was called a British victory, but it felt like a defeat. It proved beyond any doubt that colonial militia could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars, that they could hold ground, that they could fight. After Bunker Hill, both sides knew this was going to be a long, bloody war. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because even after all this fighting, after the deaths at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, the colonies still hadn't declared independence. They were still fighting for their rights as British subjects, still hoping King George would listen to reason, still trying to find a way to stay in the British Empire. That would all change in the coming months. There was a pamphlet being written, one that would transform the conversation from rights to revolution. A declaration being drafted, one that would announce something entirely new to the world. But that's a story for next time. What you need to remember is this: the American Revolution didn't start with brave words in a document. It started with ordinary people making extraordinary choices. It started with 70 men standing on a green, knowing they might die. It started with farmers hiding behind stone walls, fighting the most powerful army in the world. It started with the courage to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. That's how revolutions really begin. Not with grand plans and brilliant strategies, but with regular people saying, "Enough, no more. If it has to start somewhere, let it start here." I'm Bob, and that's the story of the shot heard round the world. Next time, we'll talk about the darkest days of the Revolution, Valley Forge, betrayal, a desperate crossing of an icy river on Christmas night, and the alliance that would change everything. Until then, remember, history isn't made by perfect people with perfect plans. It's made by flawed human beings, trying their best, making it up as they go along, just like we all do. Good night, folks.